So it turns out that every problem I have with 5th edition might actually be solved in Pathfinder. This episode is sponsored by SIDEQUEST magazine, more on them later. Greetings gamers, my name is Anto, and over the last couple of weeks I have been diving through the Pathfinder 2nd edition rulebook. I picked up a special edition copy of it, super cheap, and I have been diving through it, reading up on the system and getting a feel for it. I used to play Pathfinder 1, I played a level 1 through 20 campaign a couple of years ago, and I first got into D&D via 3.5, so I'm super familiar with kind of the background of Pathfinder. And when they announced 2nd edition, I was initially really excited, and then I played through some of the playtest material and was a little bit underwhelmed. It was too much of a change for me at the time, I think, and I didn't really want to go into a brand new system that had like no content available for it, because I was coming hot off the heels of Pathfinder 1, which had just an absolutely bonkers amount of content for it. So we made the switch to 5th edition. It made sense. I was making D&D videos for the channel anyway, but now we are maybe 2/3 of the way through our 5e campaign, and I am starting to feel the strain that the 5e system is under for what I want to use it for. I can see it starting to buckle at the seams. I can see where I want things changed, and I can tell that 5th edition probably isn't the system that I want to stick with long-term for long-term campaigns. Absolutely the system that I want to use if I had to run a session for 4 people that have never played D&D tonight with no prep. 5e every single time. The maths is really simple, the numbers are much more easy to understand for someone that's never played. Perfect for that situation. But I want something with a little more bite, and over the last couple of months I've done a couple of videos talking about what I wanted to see from 6th edition, how I wanted it to pull more elements from 4th edition, what I would like to see changed. And when I was reading through the Pathfinder 2nd edition rulebook, every single one of the issues I had with 5th edition, every single one of the things on my wish list for it, every one of the things that I have homebrewed to fix 5th edition for me is solved in Pathfinder 2nd edition. So I want to kind of talk about that today. I still am relatively new to the system. I still don't know all of the rules. I haven't fully dived through the entire core rulebook. I've just been skimming through different sections, reading up as and when I get a chance, as well as reading some of the other books that I've got here behind me. But I want to talk about it, and I want to talk about why I am really interested in this system and why I think that you should also maybe give it a look. So for this, I have notes on my phone, because what good video isn't made better by someone reading notes off their phone? I just don't want to miss anything. So we are going to talk about a lot of the things that make this system really cool, and they're going to be really specific to me. This is based on the list of things that I wish 5e had that turns out Pathfinder 2nd edition had. So it might not be necessarily your list of wants from 5th edition, but hopefully you'll be able to see the usefulness of some of these things. So first up, I want to talk about tags. Now this is something I've talked about fairly lengthy in the past as being something I really want every single system to use. The premise is that every item, every ability comes with a set of tags. So using a spell as an example, it would have a tag for its spell school, it would have a tag for different elements like that. Let's throw open the rulebook and find a spell. So we have Volcanic Eruption. It is an evocation spell that is in the tag, and it is also a fire spell, so it has the fire tag. The benefit of these tags is that you can be really specific in how you want rules to work. So when you have a spell, you can specify this spell does X with this tag to any creature that has Y, this tag. So if you wanted to say this spell will charm as the tag, charmed as the condition, any humanoid creature as the tag, and there is no ambiguity as to what that does or doesn't affect in the rules, because everything is tagged. An example that came up in my 5th edition game months and months ago, but we still reference, is does the spell detect traps, detect a mimic? We're playing 5e. I ruled that it doesn't, because a mimic is a creature and not a trap, And I still stand by that. I still think that is right. But if we played in a system that had tags, the detect traps spell could say this spell detects any trap. Anything with the tag trap. If the mimic doesn't have that tag, it's not detected. If the mimic does have that tag, it is detected. And that kind of specificity makes it so much easier to adjudicate rules questions. When you come into a situation and say, well, how does this work? Everything is very clearly laid out. We can go tag 1 affects tag 2 in this specific way. We can see that we meet all these criteria, so we just keep moving. Next up, I want to talk about encounter building. So in 5th edition, we have the challenge rating, and I have talked a lot in the past about how much I hate the challenge rating system and how I think that Wizards of the Coast are shooting themselves in the foot by not publishing the system that they actually use to make the CR for their creatures. It's different to the one we get in the book. It's why creatures don't match up when you use the builder that we get in the book, the do X, Y, and Z to calculate the CR. If you use that on a lot of the monsters in the monster manual, even in the latest books, even in Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse, you're going to get a completely different CR. And to me, that is mind-blowing. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to give people the tools to make balanced things if you have them. Maybe they don't have them. But the Pathfinder 2nd edition option is much more intuitive. So every creature has a level. There's no more CR, it has a level, and that gives you an indication of how powerful it is in relation to an individual or a group of players. So the encounter builder system makes much more sense. You can pull together different monsters and build an encounter, I think, much more easily than you can in 5th edition. You don't have to calculate XP anymore. It's just what level is the total of this monster group versus your party group, and then how what difference they have determines how much XP the players earn. It's much more simple for building encounters. Building monsters from scratch is obviously going to be more complicated because Pathfinder is a more complicated system. But reading through and looking up some of those rules, it seems like they are much more robust and give you a much more granular approach than 5e, which should mean that homebrewed monsters are more balanced compared to their published counterparts than you might get in 5e, which is really nice. As someone that makes supplement content, that is a really nice approach. Building off of that, the XP and reward system in Pathfinder 2nd edition is one that I have really enjoyed reading up on. So unlike in D&D where you have to get a different amount of XP per level if you're not using milestone, in Pathfinder 2nd edition you level up when you get 1000 XP, and the XP you get from encounters is all dependent on their relation to your level. So it's a pretty consistent gain of XP no matter what level you are. A problem that I've found with 5th edition is that players can sometimes complain that a couple of levels kind of get bogged down. So when they start off, when you're a level 1, you gain XP really quickly, you level up really quickly. But there's a period there where I feel like between maybe level 5 and 10, so kind of tier 2 play, where level progression when you use an XP slows way down. And I've had several of my players bring this up and mention how they feel like they haven't leveled up in a long time or they're not making any progress. We switched to milestone in my weekly game just to kind of get rid of that whole problem. And having a system where it's just 1000 XP, you level up, you reset your XP, you gain 1000 XP, you level up. That's a really simple situation for a new player to understand as well. You sit them down and you say, right, okay, you need 1000 XP to go up a level, just period, across the board from level 1 to 20. You don't have to worry about saying you need 108,000 XP to go up to this level, or you've only got 107,000. It's not as convoluted for a new player, which is really nice. And then kind of tied to that, I want to talk about rewards, because rewards are one of my favorite things in Pathfinder 2nd edition. The economy kind of makes sense. Doesn't completely make sense. This is a fantasy world. I don't go into it expecting a heavy sense of realism, but certainly compared to 5th edition, the money makes a lot more sense. So in 5e, common complaint is past a certain point, gold is utterly meaningless as far as the rules go. Once you get a couple thousand gold under your belt, you can afford all of the mundane items that you could ever want once, you know, you've got your plate mail and your things like that. The rules don't really give you any facility for buying magic items. You get a really underdeveloped table that's kind of like, oh, well, if they're rare, they're this much, but then there's a huge jump in quality and price to go up to the next rarity tier. We're going to come back to magic item rarity in a little bit because that's another thing. But in Pathfinder 2nd edition, you have prices for all of the items, which is really helpful from a game master's standpoint anyway. But then the way that the currency system, the economy works, makes so much more sense. So you start with 15 GP, which is represented by 150 silver pieces. It uses more of a silver standard for non-adventurer costs than 5th edition does, so you're not going to go into somewhere and pay a gold piece for a mug of cheap ale or anything like that. It's going to be much smaller scale economies for those mundane items. And what this does is it means that when you start out at level 1, you've got your 150 silver pieces to buy all of your equipment. It means that getting a couple of gold pieces is a really big deal, as it should be in a world like that, where that is the kind of economy you have, where common people, unskilled laborers, making maybe a silver piece a day. Going and throwing down a gold is big money. Imagine if someone came into your workplace and threw down 10 days worth of your wages. And as a tip, it's super common. You go to a tavern, you give the tavern keeper a gold piece and completely skew their perception of money immediately because you're giving them 10 days worth of wages as a tip. Pathfinder 2nd edition, I think, is going to make it easier to run an economy that feels like it makes sense. The prices seem much more reasonable until you get into the magic item prices and until you start leveling up, which is when you want your players to feel fantastic because they have more money, more items. Level progression from the GM side, like what do you reward your players with? That is something that I've always had a problem with in 5th edition. I even wrote a full article called Dungeonomics in an issue of SideQuest to kind of fill in the gaps of the table that you get. So in the 5th edition DMG, you get some information of, oh, here's how much gold you should have at this tier of play. Kind of if you're at levels 11 to 16, kind of start with this amount of gold. And that doesn't make any sense to me. There's such a vast difference in requirements between that many levels. So I went in and created a table using that information, doing a whole bunch of reverse engineering to say, okay, here is how much gold you should have at level 3. Here's how much gold you should be getting per encounter based on this system that WotC have already got. And here's when you should roughly be getting your magic items as a breakdown table. All of that is just part of Pathfinder 2, and it was both really refreshing because that's amazing, it means you don't have to do a bunch of work, and also kind of gut punching because it came not too far off the back of me spending a whole bunch of time doing that work for 5th edition. But there is a table that says, okay, you are level 5, here is how much gold your party should get in that level as a total amount, or if you want to give them magic items, here's how many of each level and type, whether it's consumable or a permanent item, and if you give them those items, here's how much gold you should be giving them on top of that. And that, as soon as I saw that, I think that was the moment that things switched for me when it came to, okay, I understand this system, I understand its benefits, I'm excited to read more about it, and I'm excited to start using it, because currency and that kind of economic side of things is something that's been really bothering me about 5th edition lately, just because we've had a bunch of circumstances and a bunch of situations that kind of bring up the failings of 5e's economy system. To have that straight away was so nice and kind of spurred me on to go, right, I want to read the rest of these rules. This episode is sponsored by SideQuest magazine, my monthly RPG zine, which is published over on my Patreon every single month. In each issue, you're going to get at least 4 new articles to help inspire you as a player or a game master. There's content for both players and game masters in here. There are new locations for you to include in your world. There are new subclasses and classes for players to use, new magic items, new spells, new monsters to bring to bear against your party, new short adventures for you to use when you're in a pinch and need something for this evening. Whatever your role, there is going to be something to help inspire you within the pages of SideQuest. The $5 tier on Patreon gets you access to the latest issue as it is published, and the higher tiers get you access to the entire back catalogue of issues so that you can sink your teeth into them and see all of the articles in the last year that we've been publishing. If you want to get access to cool stuff every single month, sign up using the link in the description below. All the money raised on Patreon helps to keep the lights on, helps to pay my wage, and helps me keep making videos. But for now, let's get back to talking about Pathfinder. So I'm going to rattle off some more things that I really like about Pathfinder 2 a little bit quicker than some of this rambling. Weapons are way more interesting on critical successes. A lot of them can do really interesting things, like a warhammer can push someone back, sickle can trip you up, the whip actually does interesting things, the net isn't useless. Weapons are way more interesting. There are more and more interesting damage effects. So bleed is a thing in Pathfinder 2nd edition. If you use a weapon that has the bleed status effect on someone, they will bleed and take damage over time. That's something I really like. That's something I homebrew in my own games. It's something I've published in SideQuest because it just makes sense to me, so that's really cool. There are more interesting conditions in Pathfinder 2. The condition list is expanded and you get some options that give you that are really narrative. Like there's one called Doomed, and when you are doomed, you are more likely to die. The system for death, you will die quicker, and that's a really cool and evocative condition that you can use on players to make them panic. They get doomed in the middle of the fight and they're like, right, okay, I can't go down now because I'm more likely to die. Level 20 options for players are a lot more interesting because of the way player leveling up works. Instead of getting one set ability at each level, if you even get that for some classes in 5e, instead at different levels you will get access to a number of options. So at level 5 you might get access to a certain bunch of feats, and you choose one from a number of options, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 in some cases. You get to choose one of those options. So every character, you can make really unique characters because you get these options at every single level. Feats aren't an optional thing in Pathfinder 2 like they are in 5th edition. They are just the name for class abilities. So at level 1, say you're picking a fighter, instead of getting the level 1 fighter ability, you get a level 1 fighter feat, and you choose from a list of options for that, which means even from level 1, even if you choose the same ancestry and all the other options, and you just both choose fighters, you're going to end up with wildly different fighters as you start to progress because of all these different options for abilities or feats. And leading on from this, that means when you hit level 20, you have a number of options to choose from. It's not just a case of, oh, the thing that you've been doing this entire time is slightly better, yay, good for you, like a lot of the level 20 options are in 5e. I really hate the level 20 options in 5e. This should be the peak of your power. This should be when you are the master of the arcane arts and you just get one more spell slot, or you can attack one more time, or you can wild shape an unlimited amount of time. It's just not as interesting to me as it should be. Whereas in Pathfinder 2nd edition, at least you get options. You might not necessarily think all of the options are super evocative, but you get multiple options. You always have a choice, which is really nice. It can be a bit overwhelming, especially if you are playing online and you give access to all of the books. If you use something like the Path Builder app and a player goes into that and they see every option available to them, super overwhelming if you don't give them any kind of warning. But if you've just got the basic book and you say to them, look, read through these pages, then they only need to be concerned with like 10 pages, 12 pages of material for their class. Much less overwhelming, but they still get a lot of options. Next thing I want to talk about is 10th level spells. This is, again, something that I've always wanted from 5th edition. It's something that I have never understood the breakdown of spells in 5th edition. Like, when you get into that 9th level spell tier, some spells are just objectively better than others. And I think it means that you miss out on a lot of those 9th level spells that are clearly better than 8th level, but aren't as good as Wish. And in Pathfinder, you get that 10th level of spell. So all of the really incredible spells, the kind of once in a campaign defining moment spells, get moved to 10th level. Also a bunch of other cool 10th level stuff that you would expect from a wizard or a spellcaster that is truly at the peak of their power. Someone that, really speaking, you get a bunch of these folks together, they could potentially take over the world. That's the level of spell that you're dealing with 10th level spells, and it's super cool, and I love it, and no notes, chef's kiss. So that covers pretty much the entire list of problems that I had with 5th edition. I wanted more options for characters, I wanted feats to be more important, I wanted 10th level spells and the economy to be fixed, and magic item rarity, which is what we're going to talk about next. And Pathfinder just does it as standard. And that blew my mind, because I had kind of bounced off Pathfinder 2nd edition in the playtest and hadn't really given it another look. I know a lot of people who play Pathfinder 2nd edition who talk really good things about it, but because I hadn't taken a look at it and because nobody had explained it in the way that made sense to me as to why I should be taking a look at this over carrying on with 5th edition or playing Pathfinder 1st edition, which I was already familiar with, it never really clicked with me of, oh, why should I get excited about this? Until I saw that breakdown of wealth and items by level table, when I just happened to be in the mindset of, God, the way 5th edition does this is dumb, that everything clicked in place, and I got really excited to read it. And the more I read it, the more I like it. One last thing I want to talk about before I kind of wrap this whole ramble up is magic item rarity. So 5th edition works on the assumption that the rarer an item is, the more powerful it is sometimes. It's never clearly defined what makes an item rare versus rare, very rare in terms of power, beyond it being just the +1, +2, +3 bonuses. When you get into the more esoteric options, it's not really clear. And then there's a real disparity between the worst uncommon item and the best uncommon item, the worst rare item and the best rare item. And the whole thing is a bit of a mess. And tying rarity directly to power, directly to cost, makes the whole system of magic items in 5th edition feel really weird. It's intended very clearly, they very clearly lay out, we don't intend for you to make magic items available to buy. These should be things that are found and rewarded. But then they have a whole bunch of tables that have got a bunch of useless magic items in that nobody wants to get, and players will forget about them. And if you run as they intend, you can't sell them because nobody buys magic items because there is no trade for them because they're so rare, and it's a whole thing. Most people that I know just play with an economy system for magic items. Yes, you can buy and sell magic items, which means that either you operate under what the book says and every uncommon item costs this amount versus every rare item which costs this amount, or you have to make a judgment call for yourself by rolling the dice. Never fun when it comes to trying to work out a reasonable cost for something, or use something like the sane magic item prices which is floating around online, which gets you some of the way there, but again feels really arbitrary for some of the prices because you don't see the thought process behind it, and it's not baked in from the start. Whereas what Pathfinder 2nd edition does is rarity is actually completely devoid from power. So you have an indication of power, which they do via a level system. So every item has a level rating from level 1 to 20, and that tells you, is this item suitable for a character of this level? You've got a level 1 character, if you give them a level 1 item, that is going to be, for the most part, appropriate for them to have. If you have a level 5 character and you give them a level 15 item, chances are you've given them an item that's far too powerful, and it might play some really unexpected games with the balance. But that's got nothing to do with Rarity. Rarity is its entirely separate thing, not tied to power, not necessarily tied to the cost, although there is an intrinsic link between how rare something is and how expensive it is. But having that separation between power and rarity makes it really easy to know that you're not going to give your players something that is wildly out of balance for them and end up having to figure out a way to get rid of dozens of items. I hope that this video has helped give you a slightly different insight into Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I feel like we hear a lot from players who talk about how excellent Pathfinder 2nd Edition is. You know, I didn't even mention 3-action economy. Awesome. But we don't hear from a lot of game masters talking about how this game makes running sessions easier for you. And yes, it's more complicated than 5th edition. There's no denying that. There are more options and more text because more of the rules have a specific wording and give specific advice. But from my perspective as the GM, it makes it so much easier because I don't have to interpret every single rule. I don't need a sage advice column to tell me how something's supposed to work because it's got tags and the tags tell me exactly how it works. Or I don't need to worry about what level of power this thing is because there's a table that tells you exactly what level of power it is and where you should be giving it. And for me as the GM, that's going to save me so much time and so much of a headache of trying to strive for the ephemeral balance within a system. No system is balanced. It's never going to be perfect in every situation. But I do think there is benefits for trying to get as close as possible so that you have less variables to deal with when you're running the session. So if you make an encounter that is balanced on paper, then you don't have to worry so much about big swings of balance as you do if you just make it up as you go along and just throw everything in, which is kind of what I'm ending up doing with 5th edition, very much so. When I throw creatures at my party now, I don't even really look at the challenge rating. I look more at what the creature's AC, HP, and attack bonus is, and their damage output, and kind of mentally cross-reference that with the party to decide whether or not that creature should go in there. And that works fine the majority of the time, but it is more mental overhead than going, okay, this creature is actually balanced for this level of party. Just use the calculator and bring an encounter that actually works to bear. So to sum up, basically, if you are underwhelmed with any of the aspects of 5th edition that I've said, go online, go to the Archives of Nethys, which I'll link down below, which has all of the rules for Pathfinder freely available. You don't need to spend a penny, and just have a look at the way that Pathfinder 2nd edition does it. I'm not saying switch over to Pathfinder, I'm not saying burn all of your 5th edition books, I'm just saying this system has some pretty cool stuff. Maybe you should start out by pulling some stuff from that. So maybe take the table of how much some things cost, maybe take ideas from some of the abilities to homebrew elements in your 5th edition game. And if you enjoy that, maybe consider looking at another element of the rules to pull through, and if you enjoy those, maybe consider giving the rulebook a look. I'd really love to know what you think about Pathfinder 2nd edition, if you've played it, especially if you are a GM that runs Pathfinder 2nd edition, because I feel like we don't hear enough from the GMs of that system. Down in the comments below, let me know what you think of the system. Let me know whether I've intrigued you to maybe give it a look from 5th edition, or whether there's anything in here that you wished was in 5th edition or the next edition of D&D or whatever they're going to call it. But until next time, happy gaming.